You are actively destroying your Ford drivetrain every single time you park. And the worst part is, you think you are doing everything right. Look at your driveway right now. If you see a dark fluid stain near your inside wheels, you are already too late. You are likely blaming a cheap factory part or a manufacturing defect. You are wrong. Over half of the leaking axle seals I replace on F-150s, Super Duties, and Explorers have absolutely nothing to do with component failure or high mileage. They fail because of completely normalized, seemingly harmless parking habits that slowly warp rubber lips, warp sealing surfaces, and force critical differential fluid straight out of your axle housing. Detroit builds these trucks with tight tolerances, but they also build them with the expectation that you will eventually pay a dealership $800 to fix a leak you caused yourself. They do not warn you about this in the owner's manual because axle seals are classified as wear items. We are blowing the lid off this today. Here are the hidden parking traps, tearing your drivetrain apart from the inside out, counting down to the absolute worst offender. Habit 7. The standstill wheel crank you. Pull into a tight parking space, come to a complete stop, and then crank your steering wheel hard to full lock before you even touch the gas. It feels completely normal. Everyone does it. In the shop, we call this dry steering, and it is brutal on your front end. When your truck is dead still, your front tires face massive resistance against the raw friction of dry asphalt or concrete. Because the rubber cannot roll, that enormous twisting force has to go somewhere. It travels directly up the steering knuckle, through the wheel hub, and rams straight into your front CV axle shafts on four-wheel drive F50s, Expeditions, and Explorers. This sudden rotational force forces the inner CV joint to its absolute maximum operating angle while loaded with maximum static torque. This creates an immediate pressure spike right at the inner axle seal inside the differential housing. The rubber lip of that seal is engineered to flex smoothly against a spinning shaft. It is not designed to act as a structural shock absorber for a 2-ton truck's steering geometry. Every time you crank that wheel while standing still, you create micro-tears in the rubber compound. Furthermore, without rotation, the specialized grease inside your CV joint gets squeezed completely out of the bearing tracks, leaving metal-on-metal contact the second you finally move. I have torn down front differentials on F-150s with under 35,000 miles just to find shredded inner seals and scored shafts. The fix is incredibly simple. Never turn your steering wheel unless the truck is creeping forward or backward. Even a slow idle speed roll allows the tire to rotate, cutting the friction load on your CV joints and axle seals by over 80%. Habit 6. The hot differential dip. You finish a long highway drive, pull into a parking lot during a heavy downpour, and park your truck directly inside a deep, standing puddle. You walk away thinking nothing of it. You just triggered a phenomenon called thermal contraction, and it actively sucks moisture past your seals. During normal driving, your ring and pinion gears, carrier bearings, and differential fluid generate immense friction heat. It is perfectly common for rear axle housing temperatures to stabilize between 180 Fahrenheit and 220 Fahrenheit. When you suddenly submerge that superheated iron or aluminum housing into a cold puddle, the temperature drops off a cliff as the housing cools instantly. The air volume inside the differential contracts rapidly. This creates an immediate internal vacuum. While axle seals are highly effective at keeping fluid from escaping outward, they are not designed to resist a sustained negative pressure pulling inward. The vacuum pulls outside air, road grime, and standing water straight past the rubber seal lip. Water destroys gear oil. It does not mix. It settles at the lowest point of the housing, right where your bearings sit. It accelerates chemical breakdown, causing the oil to lose its viscosity and turning your fluid into a milky, abrasive sludge. Worse, the moisture bakes into the rubber seal itself, causing the elastomer compound to harden, dry out, and crack. A standard differential fluid flush runs about $150. But if you leave that contaminated fluid in there until the seal visibly blows, the internal bearings are already pitted and ruined. Now you are looking at a $500 complete teardown and rebuild. If you just came off the highway, let your truck cool down with 10 minutes of low-speed driving before parking in low-lying, wet areas. Or better yet, Find a dry space. Habit 5. The rolling park slam. You are backing into a driveway or pulling into a spot at 3 miles per hour. Before the truck stops completely, you shove the gear selector straight into park. You hear that violent mechanical clunk, the truck rocks aggressively, and you walk away. You think you are just testing your transmission's park pawl. In reality, you are sending a shockwave through the entire secondary drivetrain. When you force the transmission to lock while the output shaft is still rotating, that sudden halting force cannot be completely absorbed by the transmission gear. It travels backward down the drive shaft, directly through the U-joints, and strikes the pinion gear in your rear differential on Ford 8.8-inch and 9.75-inch rear ends. This habit completely obliterates the pinion seal. The pinion gear is driven backward and forward violently against its crush sleeve and bearings during that impact. This sudden deflection distorts the pinion seal lip, pushing it off-center. Do this a few hundred times, and the seal loses its tension entirely. Replacing a wheel axle seal is annoying. Replacing a pinion seal is a precise, labor-intensive nightmare. The drive shaft must come off, the pinion nut must be removed, and a technician must carefully set the exact rotational torque specs on the bearing preload. A 0-50 mistake on that preload will whine and destroy your entire differential gears within an hour. Stop treating your transmission like a brake pedal. Come to a dead stop. Keep your foot firmly on the service brake. Shift to park. Engage the parking brake. Only then do you let your foot off the floor. Habit 4. The grade-leaning crush. This is the single most destructive parking habit in the automotive world, and it is responsible for more rear axle seal failures on Ford trucks than every other factor combined. You park on an incline, a driveway, or even a slight slope, and you shift into park without using your parking brake. When you do this, the entire gross weight of your vehicle, often over 5,000 pounds, reinstates itself directly on a tiny steel wedge inside your transmission, called the park pawl. But the physical weight doesn't stop there. Because the wheels are trying to roll backward downhill, that immense gravitational load stays locked hard inside your axle shafts. Your rear axle shafts are now being subjected to a massive, continuous lateral force in one single direction. The shaft physically deflects, pushing hard against the bottom or side of the axle seal. Axle seals are carefully engineered to seal against dynamic centered rotational forces. They are completely incapable of handling thousands of pounds of static, one-sided lateral pressure for 12 hours at a time. Over months of parking on a slope without your brake, the rubber undergoes what engineers call a compression set. The rubber permanently deforms. It flattens on the side, taking the load, and stretches thin on the opposite side. The second you start driving, the wobbly shaft leaves a microscopic gap where the seal is permanently compressed. Differential oil immediately begins leaking onto your brake backplates and inside your wheel assemblies. On full-floating Super Duty axles, the repair requires pulling the entire heavy axle shaft out just to get to the hub seals. The fix costs $0. Use your parking brake every single time you park, regardless of whether you are on a hill or flat ground. Set the brake before you put the transmission in park, letting the brake pads hold the truck's weight, not your expensive internal drivetrain components. If you think a compressed seal on a flat driveway is bad, wait until you see what happens when you introduce a common concrete barrier into the equation, because the next 3 habits prove that what you can't see will absolutely bankrupt you. Habit 3. The concrete barrier. Bash. You pull into a parking space. Use your front bumper or tires to gauge the distance, and roll forward until you feel a solid thud against the concrete parking block. Some people even give it a little extra gas just to ensure they are wedged tightly against the curb. You think you are using a harmless parking reference point. In engineering terms, you are subjecting your wheel hubs and drivetrain seals to an instantaneous, unyielding lateral shock load on modern Fords equipped with independent front suspension, which includes the F-150, Explorer, Expedition, Edge, and Escape. The front CV axle passes directly through a precision rubber seal pressed into the aluminum housing of the front differential or transmission. When your tire strikes a rigid concrete block at even 1 mile per hour, that kinetic energy cannot be dissipated by the tire's sidewall alone. The impact force travels instantly through the wheel hub assembly, completely bypasses the coil springs, and drives the steel axle shaft inward toward the center of the vehicle. This creates an immediate, violent alignment deflection. The hardened steel shaft slams into the delicate, spring-loaded inner lip of the axle seal. Worse yet, the impact hammers the wheel bearings themselves. Rear axles are just as vulnerable. When a rear tire hits a curb hard, it forces the entire axle shaft to shift laterally against its retaining C-clips or bearing outer races. Over time, these repetitive impacts cause the wheel bearings to develop microscopic play, measuring as little as 0.005 of an inch. Once a bearing develops play, the axle shaft no longer rotates on a perfectly true center axis. It begins to wobble microscopically at highway speeds. This constant radial runout chews up the inner diameter of the rubber seal lip within a matter of months, creating an unsealed path for your fluid to escape. A brand new axle seal costs roughly $30 in raw materials. However, because the worn bearing caused the failure, replacing just the seal is a complete waste of time. The shaft wobble will destroy the new seal in less than 3,000 miles. You are forced to pay for a brand new hub bearing assembly and a new seal, turning a minor issue into a $900 professional repair. The solution is completely free. Stop using physical impacts to park your vehicle. Ford installs multi-angle backup cameras, front proximity sensors, and dynamic grid lines on almost every vehicle they build. Use your mirrors, look at your digital display, and intentionally leave 3 inches of clearance between your rubber and the concrete. Habit 2. The frantic traction crank winter hits, or you find yourself on a muddy job site and your truck gets stuck. Panic sets in. You mash the accelerator pedal down, spin the tires at 40 miles per hour on the ice, and violently crank the steering wheel back and forth from left lock to right lock, hoping the tread will suddenly bite into something solid. This is the absolute fastest way to completely rupture a front CV axle boot and blow an inner axle seal simultaneously. When you spin a tire freely on a low-friction surface like ice or mud, the differential sends all available rotational speed to that wheel. Suddenly, the tire cuts through the slick layer and grabs high-traction pavement or dry rock underneath. The resulting torque spike through the axle shaft is astronomical, jumping from zero load to thousands of foot-pounds of rotational force in a millisecond. When you combine that immense torque spike with the front wheels being turned to an extreme angle, you create a worst-case scenario for the rubber components. At full steering lock, the flexible rubber or silicone CV boot is stretched to its absolute physical limit on one side and tightly compressed on the other. The sudden jerk of the axle shaft catching traction causes the CV joint to violently load, stretching the boot material past its tensile strength and tearing it wide open. Once that boot splits, centrifugal force throws all the internal lubricating grease out onto your set suspension components. Without grease, the CV joint overheats, develops massive mechanical play, and begins transferring a violent vibration straight down the axle shaft into the front differential seal. Furthermore, if your Ford is equipped with an electronic locking differential, E-locker, and you engage it while cranking the wheels on a mixed traction surface, you force both shafts to turn at the exact same speed while traveling along completely different turning radii. This creates massive binding forces that physically push the axle shafts outward, distorting the differential housing seals until fluid starts pouring out. The financial math on this is brutal. Spending 5 minutes calmly digging out your tires or using a $40 set of plastic traction boards saves you from a massive mechanical disaster. If you blow the CV boot and destroy the inner seal during a frantic spinning session, you are looking at a $750 bill for a new CV axle assembly. An inner differential seal, fresh gear oil, and the associated specialized labor. The actionable fix is straightforward. If your vehicle gets stuck, keep your front wheels pointed completely straight. Keeping the wheels straight aligns the CV joints perfectly, allowing the steel shafts to handle the torque spikes safely without placing uneven stress on the rubber boots or axle seals. Gently modulate the throttle, allow the factory traction control system to manage wheel slip, and rock the truck smoothly between drive and reverse without touching the steering wheel. Habit 1. The angled overnight strain you pull up to your house. parallel park on the side of the road, or park in your own slanted driveway. And you shut off the engine with the front wheels turned at a sharp angle. You leave the truck sitting in that exact position overnight, or worse, for an entire weekend while you use another vehicle. This is the single most widespread parking habit among Ford owners, and it is a silent killer for your front drivetrain. When you leave your steering wheel cranked while the vehicle is stationary for extended periods, your front CV axles are forced to rest in a severe, highly stressed geometric position. The internal bearings of the CV joint are pressed hard against the outer edge of their housing, squeezing out the protective layer of grease. With the vehicle sitting cold, the grease separates and settles to the absolute lowest point of the boot, leaving the upper bearing surfaces exposed to bare oxygen and moisture. Simultaneously, the front axle seals, where the shaft enters the transmission or transfer case, are held in a severely misaligned, off-center state, just like the compression set that ruins rear axles on steep inclines. The front axle seal lip undergoes permanent elastomeric deformation when left in this position for 8 to 12 hours at a time. The rubber compound conforms to the distorted, angled shaft when you start the truck the next morning and drive away. The wheels straighten out, but the deformed rubber seal lip cannot snap back to its perfectly round shape fast enough for the first few miles of your drive. A microscopic gap exists between the spinning axle shaft and the hardened out-of-round seal lip. High-pressure lubricant escapes with every single rotation. This specific habit explains why so many city-driven Explorers, Edges, and F-150s experience mysterious front-end seal failures at 40,000 miles, long before the factory warranty should ever be a concern. The owners blame the manufacturer. But the root cause is the daily 10-hour static strain they place on the rubber components. Fixing this requires nothing more than 2 seconds of your time before you turn the key off. Once you complete your parking maneuver, look down at your steering wheel and center it completely. Straightening the wheels returns the front CV axles to their neutral, zero-angle baseline. This allows the internal grease to coat the bearings evenly, relieves the tension on the flexible CV boots, and ensures that the axle seal cools down in a perfectly concentric circle around the shaft. The only exception to this rule is when you are legally required to curb your wheels on a steep hill for runaway safety. For every other parking scenario, your garage, a flat driveway, or a standard commercial parking lot, straighten your wheels. It costs you absolutely nothing. Yet it completely eliminates the progressive deformation that causes premature drivetrain leaks. You have been handed the exact mechanical realities of how your daily parking routine is draining your wallet and ruining your drivetrain. But the hidden structural vulnerabilities inside these Ford axle assemblies run even deeper than simple rubber degradation. And what happens inside the differential case when these habits combine is far worse than a few drops of oil on the ground. Habit 1. The overloaded static drop. You hook up a heavy trailer, pile a massive load of concrete bags into the truck bed, or pack your SUV to its maximum weight capacity for a cross-country trip. You drive for hours, pull up to your hotel or campsite, and leave the fully loaded vehicle sitting exactly like that for days. You think you are just saving yourself the effort of unloading tonight. In reality, you are subjecting your rear axle seals to a prolonged, crushing force that goes well beyond what they endure during dynamic highway driving. When your Ford truck is moving down the road under a heavy load, your suspension, tires, and axle shafts are in constant, dynamic motion. The rear axle shafts inside an F-150's semi-floating 9.75-inch rear end are supported by a single outer wheel bearing. As the truck rolls, the axle shaft rotates continuously, distributing any weight-induced flexing forces evenly across the entire circumference of both the bearing and the rubber axle seal lip. However, the moment you park that heavily loaded truck and let it sit static, that immense weight turns into a localized mechanical hammer. The severe downward force of the payload pushes the steel axle shaft hard against the bottom edge of the axle seal. Because the shaft is completely stationary, all of that concentrated weight presses into a single millimeter of the rubber compound for hours or days on end. This static overloading triggers severe, rapid elastomer degradation. The rubber lip loses its elasticity under the constant pressure and heat from the recent drive, causing it to flatten out permanently on the bottom side. Simultaneously, the top side of the seal is stretched taut, creating a microscopic gap between the rubber and the top of the axle shaft. When you finally unload the truck days later, the suspension springs back up, and the axle shaft centers itself again. But the damaged seal lip can no longer recover its original shape. The next time you hit the highway, high-velocity differential fluid is slung directly out of that permanent gap, completely soaking your rear brake shoes or rotor assemblies. The economic consequences of this mistake are severe. Contaminating your rear brakes with gear oil ruins the friction material completely. Cleaning them off with brake cleaner will not save you. The oil bakes into the pads. You are forced to pay for a complete rear brake job, including new pads, rotors, and labor, alongside the standard axle seal and fluid replacement. What could have been a simple unloading task turns into an immediate $200 repair bill. The actionable fix is simple. Never leave your vehicle parked under maximum payload or towing tongue weight for extended periods. If you finish a heavy haul, unhook the trailer or unload the bed as soon as you reach your destination. If you must leave the trailer attached overnight for safety, use heavy-duty jack stands under the trailer frame to lift and support the tongue weight, taking the crushing static load completely off your truck's rear axle, housing, and seals, the ultimate drivetrain trap. The high-pressure washdown. This is the absolute most deceptive, destructive, and financially devastating habit in the entire automotive world. It is the #1 cause of sudden, catastrophic differential failure on low-mileage Ford vehicles, and it is performed by the most meticulous, well-meaning owners who think they are providing the highest level of care for their investment. You spend a weekend off-roading, driving through winter road salt, or working on a dusty site. Wanting to keep your truck pristine, you take it to a high-pressure car wash or use a commercial-grade pressure washer at home. You crouch down, point the high-powered wand directly underneath the vehicle, and blast the rear axle, housing, the wheel hubs, and the back plates to remove every single speck of dirt. You think you are protecting your truck from rust and corrosion. In engineering terms, you are using hydraulic force to completely bypass every factory defensive barrier built into your drivetrain. An axle seal is designed to hold low-pressure fluid inside a housing while deflecting natural splashing water and road spray coming from the outside. It relies on a delicate garter spring that wraps around the rubber lip, keeping a precise light tension against the spinning metal shaft. The seals are rated to handle regular external moisture, but they are completely incapable of withstanding a concentrated stream of water pressurized at 1,500 to 3,000 pounds per square inch, psi. When you point that high-pressure wand directly at the junction where the axle shaft enters the housing, or where the drive shaft meets the pinion seal, you blast right past the rubber sealing lip. The extreme hydraulic force lifts the spring-loaded lip off the metal surface, instantly injecting high-pressure water, fine sand, and road grime directly into the clean differential housing. Worse yet, many owners inadvertently blast the differential vent breather tube. Ford installs a remote breather valve on top of the axle housing to allow the differential to breathe as it heats up and expands. If you spray high-pressure water directly at or near that breather, the water enters the tube and drains straight down onto your ring and pinion gears. Once water enters the differential through this method, it goes unnoticed. There are no warning lights on your dashboard for contaminated gear oil. The water mixes with the high-performance synthetic fluid, instantly creating an emulsified, frothy mixture that looks like a tan milkshake. This mixture completely loses its film strength. Under the extreme pressures generated between the ring and pinion teeth, the fluid shears away entirely, leaving raw metal-on-metal contact. Within less than 5,000 miles of that high-pressure wash, your differential will begin to emit a faint, high-pitched whine at highway speeds. That whine is the sound of your hardened steel gear teeth wearing themselves into dust because they lack lubrication. By the time you hear that sound, the damage is irreversible. The bearings are pitted, the gear teeth are scored, and the axle shafts are gouged. The economic contrast here is staggering. Spending $5 at a self-serve car wash to blast your undercarriage can effortlessly trigger a $2,500 to $4,500 complete differential replacement. You cannot simply swap a seal at this stage. The entire internal carrier assembly, ring and pinion set, and every single bearing must be pressed out, replaced, and meticulously shimmed by a specialist. The actionable fix is simple but non-negotiable. Keep all high-pressure spray wands completely away from your drivetrain seals and vent breathers. When cleaning the underside of your Ford, use a standard garden hose with a regular spray nozzle. Low-pressure, high-volume water is more than enough to safely wash away mud, dirt, and road salt without overcoming the tension of your rubber seals. If you must use a pressure washer for heavy mud, stay at least 2 to 3 feet away from the wheel hubs, the front CV joints, the pinion flange, and the axle housing vents. The final warning: protect your drivetrain today. Every single mechanical vulnerability we have exposed today comes down to a fundamental conflict between driver behavior and basic physics. Your Ford truck or SUV is a highly engineered machine capable of incredible work, but it is entirely dependent on tiny, vulnerable rings of rubber to keep its lifeblood inside the mechanical components. The manufacturers will not warn you about these habits because premature wear items keep dealership service bays full and profitable. It is entirely up to you to protect your investment. Let's summarize the 7 zero-cost adjustments you must implement immediately to save your wallet from a catastrophic repair bill. Roll before you turn. Never turn your steering wheel while completely stationary. Always ensure the vehicle is moving slightly to protect your front CV axles and inner seals. Avoid thermal shock. Let your differential cool down before parking in cold, standing water to prevent internal vacuum suction. Stop completely before park. Eliminate the rolling transmission slam to keep your pinion seal from distorting and leaking. Use your parking brake first. Let your brake pads carry the vehicle's weight on slopes, preventing permanent compression set on your rear axle seals. Ditch the curb guides. Stop using concrete parking blocks as a physical stopping reference. Rely on your sensors and cameras to avoid bearing play. Keep your wheels straight when stuck. Avoid aggressive, full-lock wheels spinning in snow or mud to prevent sudden torque spikes from rupturing your CV boots. Contour your wheels overnight. Straighten your steering wheel every single time you park to keep your front axle components in a neutral, stress-free resting state. Unload your payload promptly. Remove heavy static weight from the truck bed or trailer tongue to avoid crushing your rear wheel seals. Ban high-pressure blasting. Never spray high-pressure wash wands directly at your axle junctions, hubs, or differential breathers. Take action today. Change your routine. Check your driveway for fluid spots and share this information with every Ford owner you know. Stop paying for repairs that could have been avoided with zero tools and $0. Your truck and your wallet will thank you.